Before we recorded, you were telling me that 90 to 95% of the people, the most toxic relationship they have is with themselves. Explain.
Yeah, I mean, we get complaints of, hey, I'm in a toxic workplace or in a toxic relationship. But, whenever I ask audiences how many of you are self critical, 90 to 95% of people raise their hand. And they say that, when they make a mistake or something, the words they use for themselves are, you're such an idiot, or way worse than that, right? Now, if you think about it, if your best friend were to call you, what would you say to them if they made a big mistake? People usually say, oh, you're okay. Everything is going to be fine. Everyone makes mistakes, like such kind words. But to ourselves, they're really harsh. And if you look from a psychological perspective, self-criticism is self-loathing. So 90 to 95% of people are walking around with self-loathing. First of all, it makes absolutely no sense to be in a destructive relationship with yourself. But second of all, it completely disconnects you from yourself and from your ability to show up as your fullest potential. How can you if you're sabotaging yourself in the background?
So, is the main marker of somebody who has a toxic relationship with themselves, is it the self-criticism, or are there other things that you think people should look for, whether it's the people they spend time with, their habits, like what should people pay attention to?
I love that you said that because oftentimes our relationship with ourselves is going to be reflected on the outside. So if you find yourself in a relationship with people are crossing your boundaries or taking advantage of you, take a look. Like, maybe you walked in there by accident, but sometimes our external circumstances are trying to teach us about our own need for more self-respect, for more kindness to ourselves, for lack of a better term. And it doesn't make sense. Self-destruction doesn't make sense. It's kind of like, if a terrorist were to walk in the room with a loaded weapon looking dangerous, you're going to go into fight or flight. Well, having that same person living inside your head, it actually increases your stress response. And it just makes no sense when you think about it. And it's really destructive. And most people don't know, they're not aware of it because it runs in families and societies. It's normal. Everybody's doing it. So you fail to question it. And that's, for me, sovereignty. And that's why I wrote sovereign, because sovereignty is becoming aware of the patterns that are ruling your mind, the programs, and then freeing yourself from them.
We're going to dive deep into intuition today. But I think it's important when we kind of talk about what we're talking about now, because I think if you hate yourself, it's hard to trust somebody that you hate, right? Like, I don't trust anybody that I don't like. I mean, just don't, right? And I'm sure people listening to this, I'm sure everybody kind of agrees with that it's hard to trust somebody that you don't really respect or like. Um,
And actually, from a psychological perspective, it's linked to depression, anxiety, fear of failure, and less willingness to want to try again, which is the opposite of resilience. So you see how, like, even the data shows it's like stopping you from showing up at your fullest potential. But if you have a more life supportive relationship with yourself, then you show up with better mental health, better physical health, better relationships. Because the harder you're on yourself, the harder you're going to be on the people you love the most and want to hurt the least. And the list goes on. I mean, it really builds resilience.
you talked about your book, Sovereignty. How does somebody become self-aware of their patterns so that they can begin to work on them if they do have a very unhealthy relationship with themselves that they're not aware of?
Yeah. So one is work you can do with yourself through things like meditation, for example, that just train you just to sit there and you become aware of the kinds of thoughts that are governing your life. Some people choose to do therapy or other kinds of modalities like that. But the other thing is your relationships. Like, look at your relationships. Where are people triggering you? How are they triggering you? What are your triggers to begin with? If you're someone who could get triggered by a kid when you feel a kid can make you feel disrespected because your disrespect trigger is so big because that's one of your core wounds or one of the things you're working on. Is it the kid or is it just your issue with self-respect, right? So your relationships, especially the personal ones, are the ones that are going to really show a mirror in front of you if you choose to be self-aware, because the other way to do it is just point fingers. And that's the opposite of self-awareness. I mean, not that, people can't be jerks or abusive and all that, but it's really important to see, especially if there are patterns in your life where, oh, look, I'm in this situation at work and at home or and in my friends circle.
Once somebody's become aware of some of these patterns and they've kind of come to terms with how they've been treating themselves, what are some ways that you found to be effective to kind of pattern interrupt, to reframe how they treat themselves?
I love that, because what happens when you become self-aware is you start to take responsibility rather than blaming the world, right? And so one of the deepest sort of imprints that can govern us is, for example, from trauma. And I've worked with veterans with combat trauma. We ran a study looking at a breathing practice called sky breath meditation. And we found that after learning this for about a week, their anxiety normalized and they were able to do things they weren't able to do before. For example, one of the veterans couldn't go near a bridge because he would just start sweating and going into fight or flight because that trauma is lodged in his body. His mind knows, he's like, I'm in Wisconsin, there's no problem. But his body is still locked into that fight or flight linked to the memory. And so what this breathing practice did is separate the memory from the emotion. So he could still be around a bridge without going into sweat. So that's just one example. But it's about regaining sovereignty by healing that trauma. So that's just one example.
Could you provide a quick example for somebody who maybe doesn't have severe PTSD or isn't a combat veteran, and maybe they just over time have developed patterns of talking to themselves in a negative way because of just how life is unfolded for them, or just the lack of self-awareness?
Yeah, I can't overemphasize contemplative activities, whether it's meditation. If you can't sit still, then do the breathing, because that's going to help you calm down regardless. But, if you're into Tai Chi or some kind of martial art meditation or whatever it is that gets you to stop, because we live in a world where we're going all the time, where we're kind of trained to be in fight or flight because we're trained to be in the stress response all the time. We're getting pinged from every single bit of technology that we have. Life is moving so fast. The news is awful. Like, everything is stress inducing. So we live in a time when we could almost never stop and become aware. And yet when you do that, is so powerful, because that trains you to see, okay, what's going on in my own mind and what's going on outside of myself, rather than being in this reactive mode where you're just reacting to what's happening kind of blindly without considering for a moment the role your own mind has to play, but also considering whether you like what's going on around you and whether you want to play there.
And speaking of reacting in the moment and like coming to terms with your own thoughts, I want to dive into intuition, because that's a big buzzword now. Is like, trust your intuition, trust your gut, think intuitively. From a neuroscience perspective, or give an overview as in depth as you possibly can on what the science of intuition actually is.
So, I'll start with an example. I think we all know what it feels like to have a gut feeling. Whether we follow it or not, that is up to us. My friend Kushal was in one of the Twin Towers during 9/11, and the guards were saying, stay in the building. And he had this gut feeling to run, and he saved his life literally by a hair. He got out of that building. And I think we've all experienced gut feelings. Sometimes we don't follow them and it's no big deal. And sometimes it was like, oops, I kind of knew I shouldn't have gotten married to that person. That's a lot bigger deal. And so from a scientific perspective, you can think of it in multiple ways. One, you can think of it as, we were just talking about awareness, hyper awareness. And that's how the military trains it. The Marine Corps uses a program called Combat Hunter Training. And it's really about focusing your attention outward and really noticing where things deviate from the norm. So that's sort of a hyper external awareness. And again, you do have to be calm. You have to have some kind of internal calmness that you're actually paying attention, because when you're in high fight or flight or stress, your attention becomes really narrow and you see less things. Like, you literally visually see less things when you're in a stressed mode. And research shows that when you do practices like meditation, which, by the way, the military is adopting more and more, you're able to visually see more things with your eyes, which is really fascinating. I had some colleagues who ran a study, the attentional blink task. So if I were to show you a bunch of pictures in a row of, say, hats, and I embed 2 pictures of cats, and I say, like, Doug, how many pictures of cats did you see? Chances are you would say 1. It's called the attentional blink. Like, we all do it. And yet what these researchers found is that when you train people in meditation, they end up seeing both pictures of cats. So it doesn't escape their awareness. So anyway, you can think of intuition as that external hyper attentiveness. So there's many different forms of intuition. There's that, but then there's also a physiological awareness. So have you ever been around someone where you don't feel good around them? Like, you just have a bad feeling, but you can't explain it with your mind, right?
Right.
It's just this feeling. So what's going on here? Physiologically, your body is registering something, but your mind hasn't caught on yet because our intellect's actually pretty slow. For example, if I were angry right now and I were pretending I'm not angry, I'm like, Doug, I'm not angry. I'm just fine. I'm smiling and all that, but I'm angry on the inside. Your heart rate would increase. Intellectually, you wouldn't know why, because you'd be like, everything seems fine. But your physiology has already registered what's happening and set off a red flag, an alarm bell. And the reason for that is because we register, it's an instinct. So you can also think of intuition, therefore, as this sort of physiological instinct. And I'll explain why it's an instinct, because animals have the same reaction. A horse, if used in therapy, so sometimes therapists use a horse with a patient, but if the patient comes up and is like pretending not to be scared of that horse, the horse automatically becomes very anxious and is just moving all over the place. And the reason is that they're animals of prey. They've registered the inauthenticity. Even though they don't understand our human language, they've registered the inauthenticity. And if the patient is like, I'm not scared, I'm totally fine, the horse calms down. This is very common. What's going on here? We register inauthenticity as threat. So in any case, that's just another way, like physiologically, we're tuning into something that our intellect is not comprehended yet. So there's that. And then you can also think of intuition as this sort of subconscious processing in the background. Like your brain is making some calculations. There's a cognitive processing that's happening, but that's subconscious. And then you're receiving a thought. For example, sometimes, have you ever noticed that you could be working on a problem and you're trying to figure it out and you can't figure it out, and suddenly it just pops in your head when you're least thinking about it? Yeah. So that's another way of thinking about it. So there's a range of ways that we can think about it from a scientific perspective. And then, some people are better at it than others. We also see scientifically that some people seem to be more attuned to it. But it's certainly something that you can train, and I'll get more into that.
So what's the difference between intuition and like fear? Because some of the stuff you just mentioned are also signs of somebody who's scared as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think that intuition is a form of cognition that was developed as an instinctual way to help guide us in life and keep us safe, right? That's why it's probably such a rapid form of cognition, because it's meant to save our life. If Kushal were sitting there deliberating, should I listen to this guard or should I not? By that time, it's too late. But what's really important here too, because you bring this up, is that you don't want to mistake your fear for intuition, right? If you're someone who's just really scared of speaking in public, and you're like, oh, I have this intuition, I shouldn't go speak in public. Well, maybe it's just your fear. It's not your intuition. And actually, when you're stuck in a big emotion, that's not a good time for you to tap into your intuition, because you're probably not tapping into it. You're tapping into your fear. And actually, what research shows is that we're most likely to tap into our aha moments of insight. We were just talking about you tap into them in a moment when you're not thinking about it. When is it that you come up with your best ideas? What kind of activities?
I mean, you're kind of not thinking about it. You're just moving around. If I'm doing a slow jog or a walk and I'm like listening to music or a podcast, not really thinking about what I'm doing, something will just randomly pop up and I'll have to like voice note it into my notes to make sure that I remember it when I get back.
Right? Exactly. So that's when your brain is in alpha wave mode. So alpha wave is when you're not fully concentrated and you're not so relaxed you're about to pass out. It's that in-between space. And it's this magical place. You could think of it as a meditative state of mind. But Albert Einstein, he knew to take advantage of this. So he would go and play music, play Mozart, and that puts you in alpha wave frequency in your brain. And as a consequence, that's when he would find his best insights or intuitions. In fact, I have to share with you a quote by him, because he talked about intuition a lot. And I'm going to share some quotes with you, because of all people, he knew, I believe in intuition and inspiration. Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. It is, strictly speaking, a real factor in scientific research. And then he says the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift, which is really interesting when you think about it, with this perspective that we get our best ideas when our brain is in alpha wave mode. But look at our society. We are functioning always in this highly focused mode. And when you're looking at your technology all day, you're constantly focused. And as you do that, you're robbing yourself from the ability to be in alpha wave mode and from the ability to get your greatest, most innovative insights, which you get when you're taking time just walking and listening to music. That's why they come then. So then you could think of that also as that subconscious processing. You could think of it that way, or you could think of it as being more receptive in some manner. It doesn't matter at the end of the day. What really matters is that you get the insights. And, like kids, they are so creative and innovative. And yet they can build castles out of cardboard. I mean, they're constantly creating and innovating, and until you put them on a screen, and then it just all stops, right? So we all have the same creative genius as children have, and we have the same, and intuition is something that Einstein, he talks about intuition and imagination together because they're very much connected. You could think of it as, oh, I'm creating something new, or I just incited something new. I just intuited something new. It's this very closely linked process.
So to separate fear and like safety from intuition, somebody has to be like emotionally stable and regulated, right? I mean, you talked about a breathwork practice earlier. Anything you would add to that, or something where somebody could in the heat of the moment, if they're like, I need to make a decision like right now or in the next 10 minutes, anything that they could do so that they could kind of bring themselves back to a neutral state emotionally and ensure that they're able to connect with their intuition the right way?
Yeah. I mean, having researched this for quite a while and worked with the military on this, the fastest, most efficient way for you to get yourself back down from a stressful moment, to get from a 10 to a 2 or a 1, is through breathing. I mean, that's going to be the fastest, most rapid. And what I recommend is, breathe in for, say, a count of 4, but breathe out for a count of 8, or double as much. And do that for 5 minutes. You're going to get your heart rate way down. The other thing you can do is also just lie down on the floor, like just lie down on your back and stop moving, and just take the deeper breaths. The sooner you come back to baseline, the more you can get in touch with your gut. Otherwise, you are stuck in emotion. That's not a really great place to take a big decision. Although sometimes we don't have a choice, and then you have to just go with it. But see if you can even just take 30 seconds to just calm down your fears.
We were talking about this like before we recorded, and I wanted to make sure I touched on this. A lot of people who listen to the podcast, they listen to it because they're either have gone through various types of adversity, or they're going through adversity now, or they want to learn how they can navigate adversity better. I think when people are trying to make different decisions in their life and learning to trust their gut better, a lot of times their life could be in chaos and they're not even aware of it, right? That like the way they're behaving, or their habits, or the people they're spending time with, or the way they talk to themselves, they have just no awareness around anything at all. I think it's hard for people to trust themselves if their life is in chaos at the moment, but they want to make better decisions. I mean, maybe there isn't a silver bullet answer, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how can somebody bridge that gap.
Thanks for asking that super real question. No matter how educated or trained someone is, chances are they have as much formal education about how to handle difficult moments and difficult emotions as a 5-year-old, which means none. Like, we don't get formal training. And our society offers us so many things so that we don't have to feel. Most people, when they're feeling bad and things are chaotic, they're going to try to numb themselves out and suppress the emotion, which research shows actually, again, talk about disconnecting yourself from yourself, right? That's like the first thing, but also research shows that it worsens the emotion, makes it worse, disconnects you from other people, actually wears and tears on your body. What it also does is then people turn to, let me see what I can find to make myself feel better. Whether it's alcohol or weed or shopping or gambling or porn or overworking, or, I mean, it could look great. Like I go to the gym 3 times a day, like, whatever it is that we have this sense, I should be able to come back to homeostasis in some way. I should be able to come back to balance. But then the world is offering this plethora of stuff that we could be doing to numb ourselves and to intoxicate ourselves and to mask things. Most people can relate to this. Like, oh yeah, I stress eat. Oh yeah, like I watch like shows on repeat until, whatever it is, to not feel. And I think one of the most sovereign things you can learn to do is freaking feel it, even if it's hard. And sometimes I've gotten feedback on social media where people have just told me to like F off when I've shared this, But if you look at like a child, they feel their emotions 100%. And how long is a child angry for? Like 2 minutes? How long can an adult be angry for?
Years sometimes, right?
Right? The rest of their life. So they're both disconnected from themselves, sitting in this anger, which is disconnecting them from others. Absolutely. So your point is so well taken. When we're disconnected from ourselves, how can we listen to our intuition? And that's coming back to this ability to feel. And that sucks. But if you allow yourself to experience the emotion as energy, because emotion is energy in motion, let it move through your system. If you're enraged, freaking go and like hit a pillow or whatever you need to do. Don't put it on other people, obviously, but like feel it, even if it hurts so much, because on the other side of that is your connection with yourself and is your healing from that. That feeling is going to move, and these are the hard things. And our society gives us a million temptations. So as we're to be disconnected from ourselves and not in touch, but that's taking away our sovereign right to just be who we are and in touch with our intuition, in touch with our potential, in touch with how we want to show up in our life, in touch with our ability to be as strong, as powerful as we can be, despite being in chaos. Because otherwise we're maiming ourselves while already being in a difficult situation, which is really sad. And it's not what we want.
What do you say to somebody who maybe doesn't feel completely disconnected from themselves, but over the last few years has thought they trusted their gut, thought they made the right decision, and looking back in hindsight, and they're like, oh, I just can't get anything right. I make bad decision after bad decision after bad decision. What do you say to that person so that they can make the shift of thinking that every decision they're going to make moving forward is going to be wrong, to leaving the past in the past and just figuring out a way to make a better decision based on what their gut is actually telling them?
I mean, I think it's a good idea to think of the past as fate and the future as free will, But I mean, the thing with the past is that we don't know whether something else would have been even worse. We have no idea. We have 20/20 hindsight, right? Like we don't know. But whatever's for sure is that in the past, we were always more immature than we are now. We always knew less, and but what we can do now is make sure, how am I living my life? Am I living my life in a courageous, sovereign way where I am feeling what I'm feeling, where I'm taking time to listen to myself, where I'm connecting to myself as opposed to being disconnected from myself, which is what society is teaching me to do, what consumption culture is teaching me to do, what the self-loathing programs that have been running in our societies and families forever have been teaching us to do. And instead, with courage and awareness, it does take courage, because when you're aware, it's hard. And it's hard. But what's harder? Living in a disconnected way from yourself, And that's why I wrote my book, because I saw that and I was like, this is not, we're meant to be living at a much higher potential where we're connected to ourselves. And then you're going to be able to trust your intuition more. And of course, you'll notice that your greatest intuitions, see when they come to you when you're walking and listening to music, your mind is quiet and you're connecting to yourself. It's not complicated, right? You're just out walking. And you'll find that like going out in nature is another example. What happens when we go out and take a walk in nature? You go back to alpha wave mode and you connect with yourself, assuming you're not also playing on your phone or doing whatever else, right? As soon as you connect with yourself, the solutions come.
The main way to tell if something is off, like you mentioned, being around somebody, you just get that feeling, which we've all had, where you're like, just something feels off right now. The main way is to feel it physiologically, but only if you have the self-awareness to separate whether or not it's like a trigger from your past or it's like a fear of something in the moment, and then moving through that and then making a decision. Tell me if I've understood that correctly. And then other than that, is there any other way other than the body to tell if something's off?
Another thing with the body is that if that instinct is so freaking strong that you just can't help it, like my friend Kushal running out of the building, or as parents will often feel this, they're just like, they just run and grab that kid, and there's a knowledge. When it's really a life or death situation, you're not even going to have a moment to think about it because it's going to happen through your body. The other way, so I interviewed Chip Nylon, who is an officer in the Marine Corps, on the combat hunter training. And what he was saying is that training is about awareness on the outside as opposed to on the inside. And he would say, we'd walk through these Afghani towns, and we're not from Afghanistan. Like, we don't know how to interpret the surroundings. They would bring along some Afghani soldiers with them, and they would notice, do the Afghani soldiers, are they relaxed? Are they smoking? Are they, just chilling out? Or do they look anxious? But they would also notice in the environment, this playground that's always busy is suddenly empty. Like, what's going on there? Noticing. And again, in our time when we are constantly on our phones and so forth, we're being trained out of noticing anything in our environment. I always joke as a woman, I grew up in a big city where I get harassed a lot just because it was a big city. It's in Europe. And That was very, very common. And I noticed, wow, since people had cell phones, because that when I was younger, they didn't. When I was a teenager, there were no cell phones. It's like, oh, there's less harassment because people aren't even noticing anyone around them, But the point being is that, again, if we're constantly distracting ourselves, we're not going to notice anything that shifts from the norm. But that's another way. Finally, like I said, the subconscious processing, that alpha wave mode, making time for that. You can try this as well. I mean, I've done this often where I'm dealing with a problem and I'll just sit down and meditate, and I have the problem in my mind, but then I'm just not going to think about it anymore. I just meditate. And at the end of the meditation, I have a solution coming in my mind. So at some point in it, because you're just letting that subconscious come up. Or, you could think of it in a different way, like you're being receptive, whatever way you want to think about it.
But you said in tandem with that, it's also important for people to practice the self-awareness around their past and their patterns so that they can tell the difference if it's something's actually off or if it's just like a trigger from their past coming up that has nothing to really do with the current situation, has everything to do with something that happened a few years ago or a few months ago or whatever, right?
It's so true. Whether that's fear or shame, or whatever it is, that's a trigger. That has to do with us.
My next question gets into, like, people always want to know like where they stand on certain things. Like, how do I know if I need to improve? How does somebody actually know that they have a good gut instinct?
Often encourage people to just take a moment to like maybe sit and journal about this and just consider, okay, when have I had really strong gut feelings and what have they led me to? Like I remember at 17 having a really strong gut feeling about where I wanted to go to college. I just knew I had to go there, and I got in there, and it wasn't a very happy experience there, but it majorly shaped my life and influences it to this day. And I realized I've had several things happen where I realized I had to be there because I ended up coming back and teaching there again. The way that things worked out, it just felt like, okay, my gut feeling was right. I wasn't happy there, but it was still right. You know what I mean? So sometimes even if your gut feeling wasn't the thing that made you happiest, it may still have led you somewhere that you really needed to learn something from. But I would say, as you move forward, there's a couple things you can test your intuition on, small things, and see if you do things like a meditation practice, whether it gets a little sharper. One meditation may not do it, but let's say you decide to meditate using an app. Like I use an app called Sattva. Like I use it every day, twice a day, and see what happens after a month when you use your intuition on small things that are not so significant, so you don't feel like you're taking a big risk. And actually, there's one of my colleagues, Scott Barry Kaufman, who also has a podcast. His dissertation looked at, whether certain people are better at detecting sort of implicit patterns, or you could think of as this sort of ability to perceive things that others may not see because they're subliminal or something like that. And he found that people who are better at that tend to be people who are more abstract thinkers, who are focused more on sort of patterns rather than facts, data, and their five senses, right? They're not just always like the here, the now, my body, and facts, but they also have this creative, you could think of it more like a more artistic way of going about life. They tend to have a better intuition to begin with. Also, people who learn languages fairly easily. And then finally, people who have this personality trait called openness to experience, which is a personality trait that reflects receptivity to new ideas and experiences, creativity, just this idea of being just really open. So those are some personality traits that are related to it. But again, it's still something you can train as long as you are doing those things to connect to yourself, whether through meditation or through any of the kind of practices we talked about earlier.
So my follow-up question to that is, how do you convince somebody who's like more of a logical thinker, who's more of like a type A person, to like tap into this?
Well, first of all, 85% of CEOs report using their intuition at some point. She has a story of Lynn Tilton, who graduated from Yale as a single mom, and it was the 80s, and she went to Wall Street to work on Wall Street, where she was sexually harassed every day by both clients and colleagues, but had to work to support her child. And then in her 30s was kind of like, all right, I'm out of here. I'm retiring now. I've made enough money. And she retired to Florida with her daughter. And then she received an intuition that came to her in the form of a dream. And it was her deceased father. He had deceased when she was a high school student, and she had firsthand experienced what it's like when the primary provider is gone. He perceived him through this sort of intuition in her dream, saying, "This is not what I had in mind for you." And so she decided she needed to do something about her life, something different, and contribute in some way. And she decided to do everything she could to stop families from losing a main provider. So she would go around and buy companies that had been given up for dead. All the consulting companies had given up on them, and she bought them and she turned them around. So one of her nicknames is the turnaround queen. She became the owner of the largest woman-owned business in America, Patriarch Partners, and has saved 700,000 jobs because she used her intuition. Now, I interviewed her for my book Sovereign, and when she talked about intuition, she said that she absolutely goes from her intuition, but that intuition without intellect is like buying a plane without any propulsion. So the idea, the insight comes from intuition, but then you use your logic and your reason to make it happen, right? To work it out. I also share data by my colleague Joe Michaels, a neuroscientist, who found that in decision making, you're going to make a much better decision using your intuition if the decision is complex. So like if you have an easy decision to make, like whatever, my phone's broken, I need a new one. Okay, that's not a complicated decision. But hey, I need to move to another city for this new job. Should I do it? Should I not? There's a lot of things that play, family, etc., that I need to consider. That's a complicated decision. And so that's where going with your gut, when there's a lot of data to sort through, he shows is you're going to make a better decisions. And when I talk to Joe and I say, okay, so do you use your intuition making decisions? He said, I always consult the gut feeling, because he talks about intuition as that gut feeling, the feeling, more of an emotional space. I think that's wise. I think both Lynn and Joe talk about that. They use both. Well, of course, we should use both, right? So Joe always makes sure to consult it, but Lynn, definitely her intuitions come from her gut. That's what I would recommend.
Have you seen any like misconceptions online about intuition or trusting your gut that you think people should pay attention to?
I think that it's often portrayed as this sort of magical thinking, this sort of woo-woo, out there thing. And I think it's easy to dismiss. And I think it has been very much dismissed in our society, favoring reason, intellect, rationality, which are things that are trained into us in school and are extremely useful tools. But going back to what Einstein says, where he says the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We've created a society that honors the servant. We honor the rational mind, and we've forgotten the gift, right? So we have both. We're designed to have both. We're wired to have both. And it's to help save our life, to help give us direction, to help us process information we can only process through our body or in our subconscious mind. It's a form of cognition. And any neuroscientist you talk to will tell you, we don't know a lot about the brain. We talk about what we do know, but there's so much that we don't know. And just because it's a form of cognition that hasn't been studied in great detail yet, doesn't mean it's not there. And we know from preliminary data that it is there. And the military's been studying it for decades, and we've all used it in our lives. And it's something that that more and more research is happening to look into. So, one of the misconceptions that I just talked about is that everything needs to be reasoned. But another reason that we don't trust intuition is that we're trained to rely on outside sources of information. We're taught we want information, we need to learn something. It comes from outside of us. And we learn that in our education. And for the most part, it's true. You can't really build a car unless you have learned some engineering from somewhere, right? But it trains us so much so that we get out of touch with our internal cues. And there's a specific part of the brain that is focused on paying attention on the inside. It's called interoception. It includes the insula and other parts of the brain. But most of the time, we're paying attention on the outside. We're watching, listening, tasting, hearing, smelling, touching. We're constantly, looking at our devices and our people around us. But there's a part of our brain that's just for paying attention on the inside. And if anything, we override it. Like, oh, I'm tired, but I'm going to watch another show. Or I'm full, but I'm going to eat another piece of that cookie or whatever, right? And so we dismiss and maybe don't even realize the cues that are there. So that's the other thing, is that because we're so trained on believing that everything must come to us from the outside, and yet there are these internal cues that perhaps only our physiology or our subconscious mind can come up with and can realize.
I'm glad you touched on the spiritual, like woo-woo component of it, because like obviously like a lot of people, they find peace and they find gratitude and they find just comfort in the woo-woo, like spirituality world. But I think it can also, if somebody's not maybe so aligned with that, the word intuition could be such a turnoff to them, because they're like, oh, is that just something that's part of that space, and that space only. So I'm glad you touched on like the science of it, and then also how that can kind of be a misconception that it's only this quote unquote like woo woo spiritual thing. You talked about that somebody who's logical shouldn't necessarily trust their gut like in the moment when making a decision, that you should like honor it, but then go to the data, go to like reason before executing the decision. Could you walk the audience through maybe some specific examples on when somebody should or shouldn't trust their gut?
I think don't trust your gut when you're in a highly emotional space and you're not feeling balanced and grounded and centered. When your mind is racing, that's another time. There's just, and one very short exercise I like to do with people is just close your eyes. Notice there's a lot of thoughts popping in and out of your mind. What's the level of traffic? Is it a highway, a country road, or somewhere in between? Your intuition is going to come when you're in a country road, not a highway. So if you've got a highway, if you're just bombarded with thoughts, and then you're not going to hear any internal messages coming your way. When you're really exhausted and burnt out, those are not times when we're really going to be able to tap in accurately. And that's another reason too. And again, this going back to our first thing we talked about, the whole like sort of self-loathing patterns and the addictive patterns we can get into because we don't want to feel our emotions. All those are actually self-destructive habits that don't allow us to be in touch with ourselves or to show up at our best. So the more things you can do to take care of yourself, whether it's the basics of sleep and proper nutrition and exercise, but also meditation and time spent away from stimulation, time spent in alpha wave mode, time spent relaxing and meditating and spending time in nature, or just even unplugging, if you were just to take a half a day and clean your house and not have any stimulation on and everything off, you're probably also going to get some insights simply because you're giving your mind a break.
Like, what are some ways people can get better at making decisions like in the moment using their intuition?
Well, train yourself to listen inwardly when you're not in a moment where you need to make a decision, right? So when you're doing those meditation practices or contemplation practices, whatever you're doing, your Tai Chi or you're walking in nature or whatever, whenever you're doing your activity of choice that puts you in this relaxed frame of mind, you are training your mind for those moments when you're going to need to listen inwardly. But if you never do those things, then you're not, you go to the gym to train your muscles so you can be strong when, hey, all of a sudden I need to, I don't know, lift this box that fell on a person. Now I can actually help them because I'm strong enough to, right? You're physically able. But same with this. If you want to learn to tap into your gut feeling, your instinct, your intuition, you're going to need to train yourself, especially because we live in a world that's training us to only look outside for information, look outside for entertainment, and constantly barraging us with stimulation. So it's such a radical act to do the opposite, and yet you're training yourself just like you're training yourself at the gym. You're training yourself for awareness from the outside. Like I said earlier, you're going to see more things. You're training yourself for self-awareness. You're going to pick up your internal cues. You're training your mind also for greater calm and stability in those crazy moments. It's really, you're building resilience on so many levels, including being able to tap into your intuition.
And so diving deeper into the training aspect of it, you've talked about the importance of meditation, and being in silence and kind of unplugging to better understand your thoughts, patterns, self-awareness. Is there any kinds of exercises you would recommend people do on like a daily basis or even like a weekly basis where they could actually just work on like their thoughts and decisions and like practicing like connecting to their intuition and making like the right decisions? Is there a practice you would recommend to somebody who is listening to this and they're like kind of understanding what you're saying, but there's somebody that like wants to get the reps in?
Going back to that one exercise, I want you to just go back in your life, write down all the moments you can remember having a strong gut feeling, and just see what happened when you either followed it or didn't follow it. And just try to also become aware of, oh yeah, I think we can all remember, like Doug, can you remember a time you had a gut feeling?
Of course, yeah. And I never trust it. I'm always like, I always like look, and I don't know if this is common, but for me, I've definitely trusted my gut before, but I think a lot of times I've only known that my gut was right by looking back. Is that common for people?
Yeah, and you never know when your gut is going to be right. There's no way of knowing. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're not tapped into your gut. You can't know for sure, but you always kind of knew when you had a strong feeling you should do something. Like I did about the college I needed to go to, even though I was miserable there, but it ended up being the right place. And sometimes we do choose, our gut does tell us, okay, go down that dark alley because you got something to learn there, But regardless, there's never a way of knowing for sure, right? But you do remember what it felt like to have that gut feeling.
Right.
So one thing I would encourage anyone who wants to just dive deeper is, one, go ahead and write down all the feelings, all the times you remember having a gut feeling like this is it, this is the one, this is the thing, this is whatever, right? Or don't do this, or do this, or whatever it is. How did it feel? What was it like? Just recall, because you've been through this. Okay. And then the second thing is, how am I going to tap myself more into this? And like I said, there's the whole make room in your life for activities in which you are not actively focusing outward and doing something, but you're in that alpha wave mode. You can do this through music, certain music, like Mozart, for example, triggers alpha wave activity in the brain, but Beethoven does not, which is really interesting. And you know best what will put you in that space. Everybody has their own preferences. Or creativity, especially if you're someone who's just all logic and rationality, it's make some time to freaking learn the guitar or something, do something creative, like doodle or whatever. Something that pulls you out of being constantly in that, I just have to think, if we don't pull ourselves out, we're stuck in there like a box, right? Anything that'll help you get out of that. Go to an improv class, pull yourself out of your comfort zone to do something where it's completely spontaneous or creative, because you're disrupting that pattern of always being stuck in this. Again, remembering that rationality and reason is the faithful servant. It's our useful tool, but it's not always the way that we're best able to comprehend things from the start. That'll also sharpen your awareness. That's the contemplative practices. They're essential. I would think if you wanted, they're the basic. You have to meditate and find the shoe that fits. I started meditating with mindfulness and it did not work for me at all because I was anxious. I was in New York during 9/11 too, and that was not working for me. I was just more mindful that I was anxious. So I learned through breathing, which is why I ended up doing research with veterans with the sky breath meditation practice. So find the practice that works for you. Find the shoe that fits for you, and maybe it's sitting in your church for an hour in silence. Whatever works, right? So training yourself for that inward gaze as opposed to constantly the outward gaze, especially in a society that wants us to only do that. It's very radical. It's very different. You're not going to get your best insights after 4 beers kind of thing either. You know what I mean? So you just got to be in that mental space where it's just your mind is clear.
Is there anything we haven't covered that you think is really important for the audience to know regarding gut instinct, intuition, making better decisions, self-awareness? Anything else you'd like to add?
Our body is a more sophisticated communication device than any that technology has ever developed. Our brain is complex, and there are forms of cognition and awareness that modern science has yet to understand more deeply, and that many of us have yet to fully tune into. And yet, if we look even just into the animal world, we see people, how is it that the animals know there's going to be an earthquake or there's going to be a hurricane before anybody else knows it? We have these abilities too. It's a question of being able to tap into them. And we live in a time of complete distraction and self-destruction often. And turning that around and reclaiming your inner sovereignty allows you to then tap into those gifts more.
Emma, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I think the audience is going to get a lot of value out of this conversation. If people want to connect with you, if they want to learn more about your work, where's the best place for people to go?
Well, my book, Sovereign, goes into detail about this and all the different ways we can reclaim our sovereignty. So that would be the best place to start. I'm on Instagram at The Happiness Track. I'm also on all the social media platforms. And my website is myname.com, but also iamsov.com, which is my sovereignty website.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for coming on the podcast. Like I said, I think the audience is going to really enjoy this one.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.